We can do it. Yes, we can. We can change things throughout the land. But we all must lend a hand. We can do it. Oh, yes, we can. Oh, your neighbor over there, a bit bewildered, but he cares.
Hello, my name is Linda Weltner. Today we are in the middle of the Laotian jungle. You can tell by all the leaves here. And let me just tell you a little bit about Laos. It has China on one border, Vietnam on another, which was not so good during the war in Vietnam, Thailand, and Myanmar, mostly known as Burma. And so it's surrounded on all sides by very interesting countries, and we're going to interview this morning Mary Ladd Smith, who went there. She had a choice of going to the Peace Corps, but you didn't choose to go to the Peace Corps.
Correct.
Why was that?
Well, I chose not to go to the Peace Corps because Peace Corps said, we'll either send you to Africa, Asia, or the Middle East. And as a woman, I really didn't want to go to the Middle East. I knew a great deal about some of those countries, but I didn't know a thing about Laos. But I said, you know, it seems fascinating, so that was what I was interested in doing.
And so you went with a different group, right?
I went with something called International Voluntary Service, which had originally been a church-related group and then become independent. They had, at one point, headquarters in Geneva, and they, unlike Peace Corps, could send their volunteers into countries where there was an active war. And of course, there was insurgency in the northern part of Laos.
So you said, oh, great, they can send us into an active war. I think I'll choose this one. Didn't you have any second thoughts, knowing that the war in Vietnam was right next door?
I was 25 years old, and I was excited, and I didn't want my husband to be drafted into the war in Vietnam, so this seemed like a very interesting and not horribly risky alternative.
Yeah, I think I would have made the same choice. For both of you to go somewhere together instead of being separated and worry about his being dead.
Yeah.
They put you on a plane in...
Well, we were in Seattle, so they flew us back to Washington. And while we were in Washington, we received training in, well, he received training in teaching English as a second language. And I went into a 5-day total immersion course at the Berlitz School of Languages in Laotian, which just about killed me because all they did was speak Laotian to you. And until about the third day, you have no idea what's going on. And I can remember sitting by the water cooler on the floor, just half laughing and half crying, and then suddenly there was a breakthrough. And I got it, and I could form little Lao sentences, and it wasn't just gibberish coming at me.
Did your husband have any Lao?
No.
All right.
No, and neither did any of the other volunteers who were going to be teaching English. It was just a few of us. I was slated to teach social studies of Southeast Asia, and I knew absolutely nothing about Southeast Asian social studies because I'd been a sociology major. So I ended up teaching out of an English-American textbook. And because I could speak the language and read a chapter ahead of the students, I kind of kept going that way. With a very minimum amount of Lao, they put us on a plane. We were supposed to land in Vientiane, which is the capital city. There was a flood in Vientiane, so we couldn't land there. And so the plane flew us into Pakse, which is a city right in the south, just north of Cambodia, actually. We got off, first the plane circled the runway to get the water buffaloes off, and then it landed, and there were maybe 10 or 12 of us, and we all trooped off the plane, and there was nobody there, of course, because nobody knew we were coming at that point in time. The communication just isn't what it is today. Right. In my broken Lao, I asked for the American embassy, and they took us to this big stucco house that they thought was the American embassy. Well, it turned out it was what we called later Spook House.
So it was CIA.
It was CIA, and it was people who, young Americans like ourselves, who theoretically were stationed in Thailand, but we're actually up in Laos doing things in the way of observing the Ho Chi Minh Trail, helping the local Lao soldiers to set up bombs and do all that kind of thing.
And they were part of what is now called the Secret War in Laos.
They were definitely part of that, because when we walked into their house, we knocked on the door and they walked in, and there they are shoving submachine guns and grenades under the beds and looking at us like, who in the world are you? Because they didn't know who we were.
Right.
And so once we were identified as being part of IVS, they took us to another house where the IVS volunteers lived, who were stationed in Pakse.
In Pakse. Did you have second thoughts at this point?
No.
Because, we were secretly bombing Cambodia as well.
Well, not at that point.
Not
Cambodia
yet.
was totally peaceful and wonderful. I actually got there a couple of times, and it was
So
beautiful.
the war in Cambodia hadn't spread to Cambodia yet.
No,
But
not
if
at
you
all.
look at the map, their longest border of the entire country is right along South Vietnam.
And North Vietnam. When a year later we were living in Pakse and teaching at the local French lycée, you could hear the bombing on the Ho Chi Minh Trail at night. If you woke up, you'd just hear this. And it was maybe 100 miles away, maybe less.
And you
I
could hear
honestly
it
don't-
all that distance?
Oh, sure. At one point, there was a scare that there was going to be an invasion by the Pathet Lao, who were the communists in Laos. So they
Who were affiliated with the North Vietnamese, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So they issued us all walkie-talkies because they said, if we need to get you out, you have to be able to assemble somewhere along the Mekong.
We'll give you a heads up.
I'll give you a heads up.
Right.
Well, it never
Right,
happened,
right.
thank goodness, because
Yeah.
I'm here.
And did that give you second thoughts?
Sort of, but it all seems so distant. When you're 25, nothing's real. And I guess I'm also a sort of brave person.
Yeah.
Well, I was telling you, I also taught for Project Adventure, which was an Outward Bound course. And so, I got used to scrambling 50 feet in the air and jumping off on belay and camping out in the wintertime. So maybe I'm not the timid person.
There are really two kinds of people, and I think I'm on the continuum with you, which is that some people really like the security of knowing they're safe. And some people like the feeling of being alive when
excitement.
you're just on the edge. Not actually risking your life, but possibly.
Mm-hmm.
And meanwhile, everyone else is screaming, come back.
Well, that's in a way, that's the odd thing, because my parents never said anything like, where are you guys going and what do you think you're doing right next to Vietnam? I think none of us really realized how close it was.
And also in the beginning, I remember being surprised in a doctor's office reading something about we had people in Vietnam, and who knew where it was?
Yeah, exactly.
It was so far away. It
Yes.
never seemed really real.
Mm-hmm.
Now, had you traveled before this?
No. The furthest
This
I'd
was
ever
your
been.
first trip?
Oh, yes. Well, no, that's not quite true. The only traveling I'd done as a child growing up was to Michigan. And that was really a big, long trip. Very exciting.
Me too. We went to the Cape from Worcester.
Yeah, exactly. And then the first year I was married, we went to Europe and hitchhiked and, camped and did that sort of wonderful thing that kids do fresh
Yeah.
out of college.
Yeah.
But other than that, I hadn't traveled at all.
So then from there, you went to the capital.
Right.
And what did you do there?
Well, I was teaching social studies, and I was teaching at a school called Don Doc, which was the École Supérieure de Pédagogie, which was the closest thing that Laos had to a university. It was essentially a normal school, the teacher training college.
Training college, yeah.
And it had 3 sections. It had a French section, an English section, and a Lao section. So I was teaching social studies of Southeast Asia in English.
And did you make any Laotian friends?
Oh, lots of students, yes. Oh, the students were wonderful. We tutored a couple of them who just wanted extra, and then they would invite us out for picnics. So we'd go off into the jungle with them, and They would have made sticky rice and all kinds of wonderful egg rolls and things like that. I made a lot of Lao friends then.
And tell me what was happening in the government at the time.
The government was the Royal Lao government with the king.
With the king.
With the king, and there was, his brother was actually the head of the Pathet Lao.
So it's interesting. So one brother got the kingship, and the other brother
is up in the north.
Is up in the north plotting his overthrow.
Well, yes, and there was a time when the Pathet Lao came in an airplane, I think it was the Pathet Lao, and they strafed the morning market in Vientiane, and then they flew away. It happened while I was out at Dondo teaching, and we heard about it afterwards. So there were these little incursions, and they issued us walkie-talkies at one point in case we had to escape.
And that wasn't such a big deal. They didn't think it was the beginning of a major
No, because
attack.
Laos, they just thought it was, a sort of infighting, almost family infighting.
Yeah, little
It's like
macho showing off.
little this, little that, but it didn't seem that serious, and it didn't become, the country didn't fall to the communists till after Vietnam was abandoned by us, essentially.
And what did your husband do?
Well, he was teaching English as a second language. He was
in the same Ladakh?
in the same school.
Yeah.
He was in charge of the language lab, which was at the time incredibly modern. There were little cardboard boxes and earphones, and they had tape recorders with the big reel tapes, and so they could listen to various kinds of English and repeat back and do all of that.
And so you were there 1 year?
I was in Vientiane for a year, and then that was the capital city. There were a lot of foreigners. There was a lot of stuff going on, and we thought,
A lot of cars?
oh no,
No?
no, oh no.
So it wasn't really like a modern city?
Oh, heavens no. Most of the roads had open gutters on either side. Most people either walked or bicycled. There were the pedicabs called Samoa.
Yeah, where they drive you in a little pedal thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there were a few trucks and a lot of American aid vehicles that came in, and there were a lot of military trucks. You'd
And that
see a lot of
was too
soldiers.
big city for you?
That was too big a city. Yeah, we really wanted to experience the countryside and get to know Laotian life as it was more authentically lived. So we went down to Pakse, which was a smaller city.
So it was inauthentic in the sense that the military presence had changed it, or what?
No. It was just very urban, and most of the Lao lived in houses that were built on stilts out over the rice paddies, and they would do their cooking and everything in the shade underneath the house. And we just felt that the city life there were an awful lot of foreigners. There were a lot of French, or a lot of Americans. We just wanted to get closer to the real Laotian life.
Right.
I mean, there were soldiers everywhere because it was theoretically a war. But that was why we wanted to go to Pakse.
So then you went there, and did you live out in the country?
No, we lived in, well, it was like Beverly. It was a city about the size of Beverly.
But the streets were not paved, I'm assuming.
Mostly they were not, no.
And did you have indoor plumbing?
We did have indoor plumbing, just barely. It was a much more integrated place. I mean, there'd be water buffalo walking down the street every now and then. And every morning, if you got up early, you'd see the monks out in front of the house with their begging bowls and people coming out and giving them rice.
That's called Pakpa, feeding of the monks.
The country is basically Buddhist.
And where did you teach there?
I taught in the French lycée.
High school?
It was high school,
Yeah.
yes, and I was teaching English. The French, of course, had colonized Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam, and so they had brought their educational system with them, and we were English teachers teaching in French schools, essentially.
Now, the war in Vietnam was a French-Vietnamese war before that, and they lost. The French lost and were driven out.
Mm-hmm.
Why did they leave Laos?
They were still there.
Oh, it's still being.
Oh, yes,
it's
we
still
lived
being
next.
administrated by the French.
Well, no. Those countries, and you're asking me more history than I probably know, but those countries had their own governments at this point in time. It was probably 20, 30 years before that they had not been colonies any longer.
Right.
But there were lots of French people. We lived and got to know a lot of the teachers there who were from France, and that was their lifestyle. I mean, they were sort of like being in the Foreign Service.
What did you notice about the difference between the reception you got in Vientiane
In Vientiane.
and in Pakse? Rural people different?
I would say they were more relaxed. Laotians in
And
general,
things go slowly.
very slow, very sweet, very
Did
just
you-
charming people.
Did you adapt to that? Did
Oh,
you
did I slow
down?
down? Probably some, but I don't tend to be a slow, languid person, so I don't know how much I actually did, but I was just charmed by my students and by the people I met there. They were just lovely.
And they all wanted to learn English.
Many of them, yes.
Yeah. Did you read the newspapers in Laotian, or were you...
Oh, no, I never learned to read.
No, and
all I
did-
ever learned to do was speak.
And how about listening to the radio?
You know, I don't remember.
I'm just wondering what the attitude of Laos was to having such an active war next door. It would be like, here we are, and say Canada was involved in a major conflagration.
Well, I think that's what was so interesting to me, looking back, is that war can be happening in Beverly, and your life goes on in Salem, just more or less the same
until
way.
you've got cable 24/7, then it seems like everything that happens is in your lap.
Exactly,
But before that, if you don't actually see the pictures or whatever,
unless it's right there,
right.
it's like, yes, it's going on over there, but you're not really face to face with it, you know, and trucks of soldiers would drive by, and as I say, we'd wake up at night and you could hear the bombing, but there was no real sense of immediate threat.
Did the king, the royal group, have an army?
Oh, yes.
So
yes.
his soldiers are also...
His soldiers were being trained by the American spooks
Yeah.
all along the border between the two.
And so
brothers.
at the end of 3 years, your term was up and you came back and settled where?
I settled in Hamilton.
And then you helped Laotian refugees. Tell me about that.
Oh, well, that was a little later. When I settled in Hamilton, that was when I went to work for Project Adventure, which was an outward bound...
And did all the ropes
did all the
training, et
ropes
cetera,
courses
yes.
and all of that.
Yeah.
And then I moved to Weston because I started to work at Harvard with the Visiting Scholars Program, which was really an outgrowth of my having spent time in Southeast Asia.
Were some of the visiting scholars from Laos?
No, there weren't any from Laos, but
No, Laos.
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 But they were from China and Korea and Taiwan.
A lot of Asians,
And
yeah.
since I had had that Asian experience, I was a perfect candidate to do all of that. But no, when I was working there and living in Weston was the time after Vietnam had fallen and Laos had fallen, and there were hordes of Laotian refugees coming to this country. And so I was working with a church group that was helping them to resettle. And so we'd have evening meetings and we'd get their dental care straightened out and their green cards and do all of that. And I was very grateful to be able to do that because, you know, I had gone to Laos very idealistic and very enthusiastic and fell in love with the people. And then, of course, once Vietnam fell, I realized that my students would probably be first on the list to be killed because they had education, they had connections with Americans. So I was just horrified. I really felt the government had betrayed them and had kind of used us to go over there and do all this and then come back. And
So tell me the history. Vietnam, we evacuated, right?
right.
And then what happened in Laos and how soon?
Shortly thereafter, all of Southeast Asia went onto the communist side, and this
Like
was
dominoes, right?
like
So the
dominoes.
theory?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was at that point that you had Pol Pot coming into Cambodia.
And destroying
Oh,
the society.
anyone with eyeglasses was killed instantly, as I understand it, because it was a sign they had money and education.
And could read, yeah, yeah.
No, I had gone to Cambodia on vacation when I was living in Laos, and at that time it was considered to be just a peaceful, successful part of Southeast Asia without the insurgency that any of the other countries, I mean, even northern Thailand had a few insurgents here and
I
there.
was in Cambodia before the invasion also, before it fell.
Oh, it was
and
beautiful.
every little town had a health clinic. I mean, Sihanouk was a very beneficent king, and his people, I mean, they could grow their food, they weren't hungry, they had simple clothes but adequate, and the villages were very warm and nurturing.
So it seemed. Clearly there was, I mean, Pol Pot wouldn't have come to power if something hadn't been under the surface there. But I also went back later, and it was just horrifying because the streets were strewn with rubble. I mean, buildings had been destroyed. It was, you know, all of Angkor, which is what I had gone to see.
Beautiful city. And you were so close to it, and I'm sure you've thought about it. What is your judgment of the Vietnam War and its impact upon Southeast Asia?
For me, it was a mistake to be involved to begin with. I felt like it was America kind of intervening in a situation that really we didn't understand fully the implications of. And my personal belief is not isolationism, but certainly trying to manipulate any country's government or democracy or non-democracy is folly. I mean, look at Iran. Look at what's happened in Southeast Asia since we left. Look at North and South Korea. Had those countries really been able to resolve their own differences, I think we would have a very different world than we have living in now.
I think we see in Iraq and Afghanistan, when a foreign country comes in, it's like swimming against the tide, because the society it's almost like germs invading a body. It has these protective barriers for its own survival, and you've got to fight against what is there.
Well, and you don't understand it either. I mean, you're brought up in a very different culture, so you don't understand the rules, written and unwritten, and so you're almost in a way doomed to failure to begin with, if your aim is peaceful change.
Is Laos still communist? And the Pakse Lao is still ruling there? And they're not causing anybody any trouble, right?
They're Laotians. They're a landlocked country. They're virtually powerless. They're Buddhist. They're charming.
I know they're not. I've
They're
just
not
come
causing
back
any
from Burma.
trouble.
They're not bothering Burma in the slightest.
No,
Yeah.
they would never have invaded anybody.
Yeah.
It's just not their style. It was a little spat between brothers as it started.
That is interesting that one became communist. It's like you become Democrat. Well, what choice do I have? If I want to oppose you, I'll be a Republican.
Yeah.
So. Are you still involved with IVS?
IVS officially ended about 5 years ago, but the volunteers, and it had worked in many other countries besides Southeast
Right,
Asia.
yes.
The volunteers have a sort of informal organization, and we get together once every few years whenever there's a group that wants to do it. Once was in Colorado, there was another one, I think it was in California. So I'm waiting for there to be one in the East Coast, and then I'll probably go back.
So you had this experience of a competitive environment, which is another word for war, highly competitive.
Yes, and a competitive growing up in a family with 3 brothers, and a competitive educational system, and all of the American ethos, yeah.
Yes. Has Laos played a part in your choosing to become a mediation counselor?
I think in a way it has, yes. I work now for North Shore Community Mediation Center, and I volunteer as a mediator, and I've taught mediation. I did the trainings for a number of years, and so I help out now more than doing it. But I think that certainly my teaching experience in Laos led me to have the confidence and learn the skills of education. And I think also my sense of the importance of communicating. You know, for me, until I spoke enough Laotian, I couldn't really communicate with people. And living there, I saw a very different way of relating and a different lifestyle. That's more in keeping with the mediation approach of allowing people to talk out their differences and work them out together.
And you know, you could certainly say some of us are at war with our landlords. Some of us are at war with our children.
Yes.
Some of us are at war with ex-spouses. Can you think of other instances with your teenagers, and that this mediation, those are the areas
Absolutely.
that can be resolved?
Definitely. Hopefully. You know, it's never a sure bet, but you give people the opportunity to be heard and to speak, and your chances of being able to come to some kind of peaceful agreement that satisfies both parties is a great deal more than it would be otherwise if you kept
I
up
think those
your
are
walls.
skills that should be taught in every school.
I would hope so.
Yeah.
I would hope so. I think we'd go a long way in Congress and elsewhere
Oh.
if
If you want
those
to
schools
volunteer
were
to go to
taught.
Washington, your skills could be used. Thank you very much for watching. I think the message here is that being adventuresome brings you a lot. We're lucky here that we can interview all these people who have gone and done so many interesting and really somehow startling. That's the kind of people we're living among, and I'm very proud that this program chooses to highlight them often. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.
Cause an idea, whose time has come, cannot be stopped by anyone. Plant your seeds in fertile ground. There ain't nothing gonna keep it down. Oh, we can do it.